Hello, everyone. Welcome to the YouTube channel Books and Culture. We are live on this Wednesday afternoon. And I would like to take this opportunity right from the start to excuse my voice. We are in the springtime here in the Netherlands, and there is a lot of pollen flying around. And I'm extremely allergic to that. So, hence the coughing, sneezing, and weird voice. Um, but here I am. Let's hope we can make it through today because I'm very excited to share this short story with you today. Um, we are going to read together and discuss one of Mary Shelley's short stories called The Mortal Immortal. And I'm very curious to know. So if you're watching live, let me know in the chat. Say hello. Um, Tell me where you're watching this from. And also let me know if this is the first time that you encounter this short story by Mary Shelley. And what is your experience with the author so far? She's, of course, a very famous English writer. She's the author of the renowned Frankenstein that we have explored in a literary workshop at Books and Culture. There's also an online course devoted to understanding Frankenstein. So I'm sure you've heard about this novel before, but I'm curious about your engagement with Mary Shelley as a short story writer. So let me know if you're live. I would love to know that. This short story, by the way, is easily available online. So you can find it. There are many ways you can find this text online. I'm a very visual reader, so I like to have it printed out if I don't have a physical copy of the book. Because, of course, I also like to, as my students know, to annotate the text and also to include certain things to share with you today to make your reading experience more meaningful, more engaging, more interesting. So I see some people in the chat. Vandita, hello. I've read this short story by Mary Shelley for the first time. And how was it? I'm curious to know. And Jenny's also here. Hi, Jenny. Watching from a very hot UK here as well. I believe it's like 29 degrees. So that's why the windows are open, but then the pollen comes in. So that's another issue. Jenny says, I've read Frankenstein as part of the workshop you did. Yes, it was great. I'm glad you took part in it. I didn't know she did stories, though. Yeah, that's a part of her career that's not very talked about because, of course, her masterpiece overshadows the rest of her literary career. But she wrote quite some short stories, especially at the end of her career. So after she became a widow and she really took it seriously to become a professional author, a published author. So she contributed to several periodicals. And we'll talk about where the Mortal Immortal first appeared in a little bit. Sylvia is also here. Hi, Sylvia. For me as well, it was my first encounter with the Mortal Immortal. Awesome. Okay. So before we start reading the text itself, with pauses so I like this to be a very interactive session. So whenever you have a comment, please write it down. I will also ask you questions along the way. I will add contextual information, some interesting things to make the reading experience more engaging. But first of all, let's put the text into its context, right? This is very, very important. So, The Mortal Immortal by Mary Shelley first came out in 1833. So that will be about 20 years after, roughly, after the publication. No, 1818, 1828, no less than that. Excuse my math. So roughly 15 years after the publication of Frankenstein, the first edition. As you know, the second edition came out in 1831. We talk about that in our course and in the workshop. So this is a story that came out in 1833. She was already an established writer. And in a nutshell, it is the story of a young man named Winzy who becomes the apprentice of an alchemist and ends up drinking a mysterious elixir. That is a very intriguing plot line in my opinion. That is something I would definitely pick up, even if I had not seen Mary Shelley's name on it on the cover. Because of the plot, that's something that interests me. So the idea of alchemy, an apprentice, a mysterious elixir. Um, and if we think about the context of publication, that is the 1830s, so the beginning of the 19th century. So Gothic literature was already becoming outdated, outmoded. Too many stories had been written following the same pattern, the same formulaic structure. So the readers were tired. But we can definitely find traces of the Gothic in the Mortal Immortal, and also traces of sensation fiction. So that kind of fiction written for the main purpose of entertaining the reader. So it's an entertaining read. Um, and very interestingly, the story was commissioned for the Keepsake. Have you ever heard of literary annuals? Well, I guess nowadays they are also printed, but in the Victorian era or in the 19th century, these were very popular literary pieces. And one example is The Keepsake, where the Mortal Immortal first appeared in 1833. So it was an annual literary piece that contained short stories, poems, essays, beautiful engraved illustrations. So it was a highly decorated piece. So it was an anthology, a collection of literary pieces to be read along the year. And the Keepsake at least, would be published around Christmas time. And it was very popular as a Christmas gift, and you can imagine why. So then the reader who would purchase or receive as a gift the Keepsake Literary Annual would have, in theory anyway, enough material to read and entertain themselves throughout the upcoming year. Um, and the Keepsake ran from 1828 until 1857, so quite some time. It was quite popular. If you Google later on, if you're curious, you can write the Keepsake. And you can even see some illustrations that were in these publications. And you can also see that it's possible to buy old copies. Of course, old copies, they're not published anymore, but you can buy copies of these 19th century annuals in secondhand bookshops or rare books bookshops online. And yeah, they are expensive, but not that expensive for a 19th century text. And some are in very good condition. So that's something for you to know. Excuse me. All right. Its main readership was young female readers, although men read it as well, of course. Remember, the early 19th century was, in the late 18th, was the boom in publications, and literature um, developed, let's say, another objective. So not only as a means of instruction, but also as a means of entertainment. So there was a commercial a very commercial business forming at this period. Things were printed much faster, much cheaper, and people were the literacy rate was higher, so there were more readers at the time, and that of course affects the literary market. Um, Mary Shelley contributed several times to this. Um, I wouldn't call it magazine, this annual, right? And other contributors, famous contributors, include William Wordsworth, so the poets William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Percy Shelley, um, and also Sir Walter Scott, Felicia Hemans, and others. So I think that's a very interesting um, literary context, the context of production and publication of this story. So this story was commissioned to Mary Shelley. So she was paid to write this story for the 1833 edition of The Keepsake. What do you think about this? Let me know. So now you know a bit more about the way literature was produced and circulated at the beginning of the 19th century. So let's start our reading of The Mortal Immortal. That's already an interesting title. We can return to it at the end. But let me know, write in the text, if what are your thoughts on this title, The Mortal Immortal, because it's a paradox, right? A mortal immortal. Jenny asks if this would have been expensive at the time. Not really, not really expensive, but also a more decorated. So there were cheaper editions of texts circulating, but this keepsake was not expensive, but I mean, it was not as cheap, but because it was meant to be a nice gift, you know. So there were illustrations. So illustrations were commissioned for the keepsake. Stories that hadn't been published before, poems that hadn't been published before. So how can I compare it to nowadays? Perhaps, and that's just my guess, right? Perhaps we can compare it as a like um, hardback edition of a novel. It's not expensive, but it is more expensive than the paperback, but it's also a nicer gift. Perhaps something like that. So it would be bound, of course. And it was quite, yeah, um, long because it would contain enough stories to entertain the reader, or poems or illustrations to entertain the reader for a whole year. So let's begin with The Mortal Immortal by Mary Shelley. July 16th, 1833. Okay, I already stopped here because I think that's interesting. So the reader reading this story would also be reading it in 1833. So it would be, this would be, for us, it's the past, right? But for a contemporary reader, this would be the very year they were reading this on. So that would be their present. And 16th of July, so today is the 14th of June, almost there. All right, so July 16th, 1833. This is a memorable anniversary for me. On it, I complete my 323rd year. The Wandering Jew? Certainly not. More than 18 centuries have passed over his head. In comparison with him, I am a very young immortal. And now here I would also like to pause because Mary Shelley adds this reference to the Wandering Jew. Perhaps you are or are not familiar with this mythical figure. So the Wandering Jew is a biblical myth. He was a mythical immortal man whose legend began to spread in England in the 13th century. And in the original legend, it was a Jew who provoked Jesus in his way to the crucifixion. And for that, he was cursed to wander the earth immortally until the second coming of Jesus. So, in comparison with the Wandering Jew, um, the Mortal Immortal here, he's way not as old, right? The Wandering Jew is way older than him, right? As he says, in comparison with him, I am a very young immortal. Am I then immortal? This is a question which I have asked myself by day and night for now 303 years, and yet cannot answer it. I detected a gray hair amidst my brown locks this very day. That surely signifies decay. Yet it may have remained concealed there for 300 years, for some persons have become entirely white headed before 20 years of age. I will tell my story, and my reader shall judge for me. I will tell my story, and so contrive to pass some few hours of a long eternity, become so wearisome to me. Forever. Can it be? To live forever? I have heard of enchantments in which the victims were plunged into a deep sleep, to wake after 100 years as fresh as ever. I have heard of the seven sleepers. Thus, to be immortal would not be so burdensome, but oh, the weight of never ending time, the tedious passage of the still succeeding hours. How happy was the fabled Nur Jahad! But to my task. Here, there are some other interesting allusions. Um, I would also like to know your opinion about the narration of this piece. So you can tell that it's a first person narration. And how does this kind of narration affect your reading of the story, your experience? And think about how different this story would have been if it had been written in a third person narration. For example, this was a memorable anniversary for him. On it, he completed his 323rd year. Would that have had the same experience? Would that have had the same effect on your reading? Think about it and let me know. So here, he also refers to the seven sleepers. And the Seven Sleepers refers to a medieval legend about a group of youths who hid inside a cave around 250 Anno Domini, so after Christ, to escape the persecution of Christians and emerged 300 years later. So now he's comparing his situation to other immortals, like those stories of people that plunged into a deep sleep and woke up 100 years later, fresh as ever, but then carried on with their lives, got old and died. Also, the seven sleepers who hid inside a cave and emerged 300 years later. Also, not immortal in a way, but their existence was prolonged. But at least they had um, they had a limit. Let's say what burdens him so much, the narrator of our story, is that the weight of never-ending time, and this is one of the main themes of this short story. Immortality, is immortality a blessing or a curse? Let me know what you think. And he also refers to Nur Jahad. So Nur Jahad was a character that the readers of the time would most likely be familiar with. Um, it was a character in the tale, The History of Nur Jahad, published in 1767 by the playwright Francis Sheridan. And it was also adapted to the theater, so it was quite a popular tale. And the story of Nur Jahad is the following. He was tricked by the Sultan Shemseddin to believe that he had become immortal and that his periods of sleep lasted for several years at a time. So that's an interesting plot, right? Someone that had been tricked into believing that they were immortal and that every time they went to sleep, a lot of years passed during that time. So he compares his situation to the seven sleepers, to the wandering Jew, to those that plunged into a deep sleep for 100 years, to Nur Jahad. All references that a contemporary reader from 1833 would be familiar with. But perhaps they are not as, perhaps it would be a bit lost to our contemporary scene, so 2023. That's why it's important to dig deeper and make these connections. All right, let's continue. All the world has heard of Cornelius Agrippa. His memory is as immortal as his arts have made me. All the world has also heard of his scholar, who unawares raised the foul fiend during his master's absence and was destroyed by him. The report, true or false, of this accident was attended with many inconveniences to the renowned philosopher. All his scholars at once deserted him. His servants disappeared. He had no one near him to put coals on his ever burning fires while he slept, or to attend to the changeful colors of his medicines while he studied. Experiment after experiment failed, because one pair of hands was insufficient to complete them. The dark spirits laughed at him for not being able to retain a single mortal in his service. Cornelius Agrippa, if you've read Frankenstein, you've heard this name before. Cornelius Agrippa was a German physician, theologian, and occult writer from the 15th, early 16th century. Excuse me. And in Frankenstein, uh, the, the student Victor Frankenstein reads the works of Agrippa and studied occult philosophy inspired by the works of Agrippa. Agrippa's book was very influential but condemned as heretic by the inquisitors of Cologne. But Cornelius Agrippa lived from 1486 to 1535. So the year is now 1833 when Winzy, the is that Winzy his name? Yeah, Winzy, the protagonist, has completed 323 years, right? So the beginning of the story dates back 300 years previously, so to when Agrippa was still alive. And by the time that Frankenstein takes place, so that's in the late 18th century, and he goes to university and he tells the professors there that he has studied the works of Cornelius Agrippa, they're shocked because it's such nonsense, outdated nonsense. This is not modern science. These people were, like Agrippa, were philosophers that dealt with the occult and had the dream of finding the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, alchemy, turning metal into gold. So that's the context in which the story of the Mortal Immortal first takes place. There are some comments in the chat. Siva says, I felt a sense of uncomfortable displacement due to many biblical and mythological references. Immortality as a curse that runs through generation and eras, a never-ending taint. Yes. So, of course, you can read the text without stopping to look for the meaning of this biblical and mythological allusions. Yes, but once you dig deeper, as a creative reader like us would do, you get so much more meaning, right? Makes the experience much more interesting. And Siva says, immortality as a curse that runs through generations. So it's not something that happened only to our protagonist, the protagonist in Mary Shelley, but also others previously, right? So the dream of achieving immortality, this desire turns upside down and becomes, in fact, a curse. And we'll see why. Jenny says, I thought the name was familiar. Yes. So Cornelius Agrippa is one of the masters that inspired Frankenstein in his dark arts, right? His dark projects. All right. So now we know that there are two timelines in this narrative. The present, when Windsy is 323 years old, is 1833. And now we're back around 300 years previously, to when he was young and when Cornelius Agrippa was still alive. So let's continue the story. I was then, in the 1500s, very young, very poor, and very much in love. I had been for about a year the pupil of Cornelius, though I was absent when this accident took place. On my return, my friends implored me not to return to the alchemist's abode. I trembled as I listened to the dire tale they told. That story of when a previous apprentice that had unaware raised the foul fiend during his master's absence and was destroyed by him. So there was precedence in that um, lab. Can we call it a lab? Yes. Um, so dark things had happened there before, apparently, but that did not stop Windsy from going there. Um, Vandita says, I thought Windsy was conveying that youthfulness, which people are usually attracted to, is always not a boon. Once his marriage and life are affected by his youth, he desires mortality. Yes, definitely. Definitely. We'll talk about youth as well. Reminds me of the theme in The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde as well. So this desire for being forever young, how to what extent is that desirable in fact, and what if it's uh, impossible to reverse? What if this is irreversible? Then how do you cope with that? um, okay, so he heard about the tale of this previous apprentice. I required no second warning, and when Cornelius came and offered me a purse of gold if I would remain under his roof, I felt as if Satan himself tempted me. My teeth chattered, my hair stood on end. I ran off as fast as my trembling knees would permit. So the idea of Cornelius as Satan tempting him with thoughts of immortality, richness, that's also um, a trope very well explored in literature, right? St. Faustus, for example, a deal with Satan, also in The Picture of Dorian Gray. My failing steps were directed whither for 2 years they had every evening been attracted. A gently bubbling spring of pure living waters, beside which lingered a dark haired girl, whose beaming eyes were fixed on the path I was accustomed each night to tread. I cannot remember the hour when I did not love Bertha. So that's the introduction of the character's love interest, Bertha. We had been neighbors and playmates from infancy. Her parents, like mine, were of humble life, yet respectable. Our attachment had been a source of pleasure to them. In an evil hour, a malignant fever carried off both her father and mother, and Bertha became an orphan. She would have found a home beneath my paternal roof, but unfortunately, the old lady of the near castle, rich, childless, and solitary, declared her intention to adopt her. Henceforth, Bertha was clad in silk, inhabited a marble palace, and was looked on as being highly favored by fortune. But in her new situation among her new associates, Bertha remained true to the friend of her humbler days. She often visited the cottage of my father, and when forbidden to go thither, she would stray towards the neighboring wood, and meet me beside its shady fountain. So they were both from humble origins, humble families. So they were equals. But at a certain point, Bertha becomes an orphan and she's adopted by this rich, childless lady. So then she climbs the social ladder and she's put in another social sphere, which is distant from Wincy's. So they're not equals anymore. She often declared that she owed no duty to her new protectress, equal in sanctity to that which bound us. Yet still I was too poor to marry, and she grew weary of being tormented on my account. She had a haughty but an impatient spirit, and grew angry at the obstacles that prevented our union. We met now after an absence, and she had been sorely beset while I was away. She complained bitterly and almost reproached me for being poor. I replied hastily, I am honest if I am poor. Were I not, I might soon become rich. This exclamation produced 1,000 questions. I feared to shock her by owning the truth, but she drew it from me. And then, casting a look of disdain on me, she said, You pretend to love, and you fear to face the devil for my sake. I protested that I had only dreaded to offend her, while she dwelt on the magnitude of the reward that I should receive. Thus encouraged, shamed by her, led on by love and hope, laughing at my late fears, with quick steps and a light heart, I returned to accept the offers of the alchemist and was instantly installed in my office. So, what is the character's motivation here to return to Agrippa? The fact that he's poor and he does not have enough money to marry the love of his life. So, because of that, he um, decides to go back and accept Agrippa's offer, and to show to Bertha that he was not afraid of being of facing the devil for her sake. All right. A year passed away. I became possessed of no insignificant sum of money. Custom had banished my fears. In spite of the most painful vigilance, I had never detected the trace of a cloven foot. Nor was the studious silence of our abode ever disturbed by demoniac howls. So custom made him and had banished his fears, but at the beginning he was always expecting something dark to happen. So to find a cloven foot, so that is a hoof split into two toes, like that of a goat, and this symbol represents the devil. This symbol of a cloven foot has been associated with the devil for a long time. So he was looking for this vestiges of the dark arts, the occult arts, of a demoniac presence, demoniac house, but nothing happened. I still continued my stolen interviews with Bertha, and hope dawned on me. Hope with a capital H. Hope, but not perfect joy. For Bertha fancied that love and security were enemies, and her pleasure was to divide them in my bosom. Though true of heart, she was somewhat of a coquette in manner, and I was jealous as a Turk. She slighted me in 1,000 ways, yet would never acknowledge herself to be in the wrong. She would drive me mad with anger, and then force me to beg her pardon. Sometimes she fancied that I was not sufficiently submissive, and then she had some story of a rival favored by her protectress. She was surrounded by silk clad youths, the rich and gay. What chance had the sad robed scholar of Cornelius compared with these? So Bertha starts to tease him, right? She wants him to be very submissive to her wishes. Um, so, in a way, she's an interesting female character. She wants attention, right? And when she's not getting enough attention from Wincy, she pretends she's getting attention from others just to make him jealous. And jealousy is a powerful driving force, right? On one occasion, the philosopher made such large demands upon my time that I was unable to meet her as I was wont. He was engaged in some mighty work, and I was forced to remain day and night feeding his furnaces and watching his chemical preparations. Bertha waited for me in vain at the fountain. Her haughty spirit fired at this neglect, and when at last I stole out during the few short minutes allotted to me for slumber, and hoped to be consoled by her, she received me with disdain, dismissed me in scorn, and vowed that any man should possess her hand rather than he who could not be in two places at once for her sake. She would be revenged. And that's such an unreasonable request, right? To ask him to be in two places at once for her sake. Of course, that's not possible. It's not physically possible. So, this is a conflict in the story. She would be revenged because he was not there at the appointed time. So, there's tension building up, right? So, she would be revenged. And truly, she was. In my dainty retreat, I heard that she had been hunting, attended by Albert Hoffer. Albert Hoffer was favored by her protectress, and the three passed in cavalcade before my smoky window. Methought that they mentioned my name. It was followed by a laugh of derision as her dark eyes glanced contemptuously towards my abode. I would like to point out here something about the language that Mary Shelley uses. So at times, she includes some archaic terms such as methought, that they mention my name, um, the three passed in cavalcade. There are other examples later on. So why do you think she does that? Insert these terms that would feel odd to a 19th century reader, like methought. Let me know. We'll go back to it in a bit. Jealousy, with all its venom and all its misery, entered my breast. Now I shed a torrent of tears to think that I should never call her mine, and anon I imprecated 1,000 curses on her inconstancy. Yet still I must stir the fires of the alchemist, still attend on the changes of his unintelligible medicines. Cornelius had watched for 3 days and nights, nor closed his eyes. The progress of his alembics was slower than he expected. And alembics was a distilling apparatus, so a kind of Renaissance style 16th century chemical apparatus, now obsolete. So Cornelius was watching, right? Watching the liquids. Again and again, he threw off drowsiness with more than human energy. Again and again, it stole away his senses. He eyed his crucibles wistfully. Not ready yet, he murmured. Will another night pass before the work is accomplished? Winsey, you are vigilant. You are faithful. You have slept, my boy. You slept last night. Look at that glass vessel. The liquid it contains is of a soft rose color. The moment it begins to change its hue, awaken me. Till then, I may close my eyes. First, it will turn white, and then emit golden flashes. But wait not till then. When the rose color fades, rouse me. I scarcely heard the last words, muttered as they were in sleep. Excuse me. Even then, he did not quite yield to nature. Winsey, my boy, he again said, do not touch the vessel. Do not put it to your lips. It is a filter to cure love. You would not cease to love your Bertha. Beware to drink. So Agrippa is busy with something and he hasn't slept for days. And he's just human, so he needs the sleep. So he asked Winsey to guard the liquid for him and to make sure that as soon as it starts changing its color, to wake him up and not to drink it, not to touch it. And then he adds, if you touch it, you would cease to love your birthday, and you don't want to do that, so don't drink it, right? And he slept. His venerable head sunk on his breast, and I scarce heard his regular breathing. For a few minutes I watched the vessel. The rosy hue of the liquid remained unchanged. Then my thoughts wandered. They visited the fountain and dwelt on 1,000 charming scenes never to be renewed. Never. Serpents and adders were in my heart as the word never have formed itself on my lips. False girl, false and cruel. Nevermore would she smile on me. Nevermore would she smile on me as that evening she smiled on Albert. Worthless, detested woman. I would not remain unrevenged. She should see Albert expire at her feet. She should die beneath my vengeance. She had smiled in disdain and triumph. She knew my wretchedness and her power. Yet, what power had she? The power of exciting my hate, my utter scorn, my all but indifference. Could I attain that? Could I regard her with careless eyes, transferring my rejected love to one fairer and more true? That were indeed a victory. So his mind starts to wander as he watches the liquid. That's, of course, a very boring thing to do. Wait until something changes color. And he starts thinking all the sources of my misery is Bertha. Why can't I be indifferent to her? That would solve my problems. And then a bright flash darted before my eyes. I had forgotten the medicine of the adept. I gazed on it with wonder. Flashes of admirable beauty, more bright than those which the diamond emits when the sun's rays are on it, glanced from the surface of the liquid. An odor, the most fragrant and grateful, stole over my sense. The vessel seemed one globe of living radiance, lovely to the eye and most inviting to the taste. The first thought, instinctively inspired by the grosser sense, was, I must drink. I raised the vessel to my lips. It will cure me of love, of torture. Already I had quaffed half of the most delicious liquor ever tasted by the palate of men, when the philosopher stirred. I started. I dropped the glass. The fluid flamed and glanced along the floor, while I felt Cornelius's grip at my throat as he shrieked aloud, Wretch, you have destroyed the labor of my life. The philosopher was totally unaware that I had drunk any portion of his drug. His idea was, and I gave a tacit assent to it, that I had raised the vessel from curiosity, and that, frightened at its brightness and the flashes of intense light it gave forth, I had let it fall. I never undeceived him. The fire of the medicine was quenched, the fragrance died away. He grew calm, as a philosopher should under the heaviest trials, and dismissed me to rest. So this happens. He drinks half of the filter, but he doesn't tell Agrippa. So he never undeceived Agrippa in thinking that he had just let the vessel drop on the floor and break. He had in fact drunk half of it. So what happens after he drinks that? He wanted to cure his love for Bertha, because then he would be cured of his torment. I will not attempt to describe the sleep of glory and bliss which bathed my soul in paradise during the remaining hours of that memorable night. Words would be faint and shallow types of my enjoyment. or of the gladness that possessed my bosom when I woke. I trod air. My thoughts were in heaven. Earth appeared heaven, and my inheritance upon it was to be one trance of delight. This is to be cured of love, I thought. I will see Bertha this day, and she will find her lover cold and regardless, too happy to be disdainful, yet how utterly indifferent to her. The hours danced away. Do you see how the mood of the narrative has changed? It's much lighter now, it's joyful. So it mirrors the way, the language mirrors the way that um, Winsey is feeling. He's feeling light, like he has no problems on earth. Earth is like heaven to him, it's like a paradise. The hours dance away. The philosopher, secure that he had once succeeded and believing that he might again, began to concoct the same medicine once more. So Agrippa went back to his project. He was shut up with his books and drugs, and I had a holiday. I dressed myself with care. I looked in an old but polished shield, which served me for a mirror. Methought my good looks had wonderfully improved. So he also looks better. So again, here the word methought. So Mary Shelley uses this archaic language to remind the reader that this is actually happening in the 16th century. It's not in their present. This happened 300 years prior to the reader's present, even more if we considered our present as readers, right? So that's why she includes these archaic terms. I hurried beyond the precincts of the town, joy in my soul, the beauty of heaven and earth around me. I turned my steps towards the castle. I could look on its lofty turrets with lightness of heart, for I was cured of love. My Bertha saw me afar off as I came up the avenue. I know not what sudden impulse animated her bosom, but at the sight she sprung with a light fawn-like bound down the marble steps and was hastening towards me. But I had been perceived by another person, the old high-born hag who called herself her protectress and was her tyrant. So this tyrannical presence that cages the freedom of Bertha. She had seen me also. She hobbled, panting, up the terrace. A page as ugly as herself held up her train and fanned her as she hurried along and stopped my fair girl with a, "How now, my bold mistress? Whither so fast? Back to your cage. Hawks are abroad." Bertha clasped her hands. Her eyes were still bent on my approaching figure. I saw the contest. How I abhorred the old crone who checked the kind impulses of my Bertha's softening heart. Hitherto, respect for her rank had caused me to avoid the lady of the castle. Now I disdained such trivial considerations. I was cured of love and lifted above all human fears. I hasted forwards and soon reached the terrace. How lovely Bertha looked! Her eyes flashing fire, her cheeks glowing with impatience and anger. She was 1,000 times more graceful and charming than ever. I no longer loved. Oh, no, I adored, worshipped, idolized her. So, in fact, he's not cured of love after all. No, he still worships her, adores her, loves her, but that potion made him feel light of heart, with no fear, confident. So perhaps in other circumstances, seeing the protectress, the lady of the manor, he would have left. But because of the effects um, of the elixir that he drank, he feels no fear, so he goes in. She had that morning been persecuted with more than usual vehemence to consent to an immediate marriage with my rival. She was reproached with the encouragement that she had shown him. She was threatened with being turned out of doors with disgrace and shame. Her proud spirit rose in arms at the threat. But when she remembered the scorn that she had heaped upon me, and how perhaps she had thus lost one whom she now regarded as her only friend, she wept with remorse and rage. At that moment I appeared. "Oh, Winzy!" she exclaimed, "take me to your mother's cot. Swiftly let me leave the detested luxuries and wretchedness of this noble dwelling. Take me to poverty and happiness." So, because she had been playing around, let's say, with what was his name, Adolf something, um, she had shown too much um, intimacy, um, too much encouragement. So her protectress is forcing her to marry this man, even though she was only doing this to make Winzy jealous. So now Winzy appears and she wants to leave with him, to leave the detested luxuries and wretchedness of a noble dwelling. Is somewhere she writes a gilt cage, and to poverty but happiness. I clasped her in my arms with transport. The old lady was speechless with fury, and broke forth into invective only when we were far on our road to my natal cottage. My mother received the fair fugitive, escaped from a gilt cage to nature and liberty, with tenderness and joy. My father, who loved her, welcomed her heartily. It was a day of rejoicing, which did not need the addition of the celestial potion of the alchemist to steep me in delight. Soon after this eventful day, I became the husband of Bertha. I ceased to be the scholar of Cornelius, but I continued his friend. I always felt grateful to him for having, unawares, procured me that delicious draught of a divine elixir, which, instead of curing me of love, sad cure, solitary and joyless remedy for evils which seem blessings to the memory, had inspired me with courage and resolution, thus winning for me an inestimable treasure in my Bertha. I often call to mind that period of trance-like inebriation with wonder. The drink of Cornelius had not fulfilled the task for which he affirmed that it had been prepared, but its effects were more potent and blissful than words can express. They had faded by degrees, yet they lingered long, and painted life in hues of splendor. Bertha often wondered at my lightness of heart and unaccustomed gaiety, for before I had been rather serious, or even sad in my disposition. She loved me the better for my cheerful temper, and our days were winged by joy. So he was always grateful to Agrippa, although he was never cured of love. Thank, Thankfully, because at the end he would not want that. Um, but he became light-hearted, cheerful, a different kind of man that Bertha also appreciated. 5 years afterwards, I was suddenly summoned to the bedside of the dying Cornelius. He had sent for me in haste, conjuring my instant presence. I found him stretched on his pallet, enfeebled even to death. All of life that yet remained animated his piercing eyes, and they were fixed on a glass vessel full of a roseate liquid. That's 5 years later. Cornelius is dying. "Behold," he said in a broken and inward voice, "the vanity of human wishes. A second time my hopes are about to be crowned. A second time they are destroyed. Look at that liquor. You remember 5 years ago I had prepared the same with the same success. Then, as now, my thirsting lips expected to taste the immortal elixir. You dashed it from me, and at present it is too late." He spoke with difficulty and fell back on his pillow. I could not help saying, "How, revered master, can a cure for love restore you to life?" A faint smile gleamed across his face as I listened earnestly to his scarcely intelligible answer. "A cure for love and for all things. the elixir of immortality. Ah, if now I might drink, I should live forever. As he spoke, a golden flash gleamed from the fluid. A well remembered fragrance stole over the air. He raised himself, all weak as he was. Strength seemed miraculously to re enter his frame. He stretched forth his hand. A loud explosion startled me. A ray of fire shot up from the elixir, and the glass vessel which contained it was shivered to atoms. He turned my eyes towards the philosopher. He had fallen back. His eyes were glassy, his features rigid. He was dead. But I lived, and was to live forever. So said the unfortunate alchemist, and for a few days I believed his words. I remembered the glorious drunkenness that had followed my stolen draught. I reflected on the change I had felt in my frame, in my soul, the bounding elasticity of the one, the buoyant lightness of the other. I surveyed myself in a mirror and could perceive no change in my features during the space of the 5 years which had elapsed. I remembered the radiant hues and grateful scent of that delicious beverage, worthy the gift it was capable of bestowing. I was then immortal. So now he finds out the truth. Cornelius is dying and he calls for Wincy quickly in haste because um, he has been working again on the potion elixir of immortality for the past 5 years, but it's just too late. He is dying and the elixir is almost ready, but then it explodes and Cornelius dies. But what Wincy comes to realize is that that potion was not a cure for love, but it was in fact a draught of immortality. So now there he was. He looked at himself in the mirror. Nothing has changed in this past 5 years. So there I was. There I lived and was to live forever. Let's continue. A few days after I laughed at my credulity. The old proverb that a prophet is least regarded in his own country was true with respect to me and my defunct master. I loved him as a man. I respected him as a sage, but I derided the notion that he could command the powers of darkness and laughed at the superstitious fears with which he was regarded by the vulgar. He was a wise philosopher, but had no acquaintance with any spirits but those clad in flesh and blood. His science was simply human, and human science, I soon persuaded myself, could never conquer nature's laws, so far as to imprison the soul forever within its carnal habitation. And here I hear echoes of Frankenstein, perhaps you as well. Human science and human science could never conquer nature's law. And what happens if human science crosses that threshold, crosses that boundary, and challenges the nature's laws, the laws of nature? Cornelius had brewed a soul refreshing drink, more inebriating than wine, sweeter and more fragrant than any fruit. It possessed probably strong medicinal powers, imparting gladness to the heart and vigor to the limbs. But its effects would wear out. Already were they diminished in my frame. I was a lucky fellow to have quaffed health and joyous spirits, and perhaps long life at my master's hands. But my good fortune ended there. Longevity was far different from immortality. I continued to entertain this belief for many years. Sometimes a thought stole across me. Was the alchemist indeed deceived? But my habitual credence was that I should meet the fate of all the children of Adam at my appointed time. A little late, but still at a natural age. Yet it was certain that I retained a wonderfully youthful look. I was laughed at for my vanity in consulting the mirror so often, but I consulted it in vain. My brow was untrenched, my cheeks, my eyes, my whole person continued as untarnished as in my 20th year. Here I hear echoes of the picture of Dorian Gray. as he keeps looking at himself in the mirror. Vanity, yes, but checking for signs of aging in his features. I was troubled. I looked at the faded beauty of Bertha. I seemed more like her son. By degrees, our neighbors began to make similar observations, and I found at last that I went by the name of the scholar bewitched. Bertha herself grew uneasy. She became jealous and peevish, and at length she began to question me. We had no children. We were all in all to each other. And though as she grew older, her vivacious spirit became a little allied to ill temper, and her beauty sadly diminished, I cherished her in my heart as the mistress I had idolized, the wife I had sought and won with such perfect love. At last, our situation became intolerable. Bertha was 50, I 20 years of age. I had, in very shame, in some measure adopted the habits of a more advanced age. I no longer mingled in the dance among the young and gay, but my heart bounded along with them while I restrained my feet. And a sorry figure I cut among the Nestors of our village. The Nestors are the leaders, the patriarchs of the village. So he's trying to look older than he actually is. That doesn't work. But before the time I mentioned, things were altered. We were universally shunned. We were, at least I was, reported to have kept up an iniquitous acquaintance with some of my former master's supposed friends. Poor Bertha was pitied but deserted. I was regarded with horror and detestation. Of course, people would be suspicious. Why does he not age? This is not natural. How come that happens? What does he know? What has he done? Right? So they were deserted. They were isolated by the people in the village. What was to be done? We sat by our winter fire. Poverty had made itself felt, for none would buy the produce of my farm, and often I had been forced to journey 20 miles to some place where I was not known to dispose of our property. It is true we had saved something for an evil day. That day was come. See how the mood has changed again? So it began dark, then it got very light-hearted, joyful, youthful, and now it's dark again. The hours are not dancing away. They're sitting alone by the fireside. We sat by our lone fireside, the old heartened youth and his antiquated wife. Again, Bertha insisted on knowing the truth. She recapitulated all she had ever heard said about me and added her own observations. She conjured me to cast off the spell. She described how much more comely gray hairs were than my chestnut locks. She descanted on the reverence and respect due to age. How preferable to the slight regard paid to mere children. Could I imagine that the despicable gifts of youth and good looks outweighed disgrace, hatred, and scorn? Nay, in the end I should be burned as a dealer in the black art, while she, to whom I had not deigned to communicate any portion of my good fortune, might be stoned as my accomplice. At length she insinuated that I must share my secret with her, and bestow on her like benefits to those I myself enjoyed, or she would denounce me, and then she burst into tears. So this is related to something that Vandita mentioned before. So conveying youthfulness, but once his marriage and life are affected by his youth, he desires mortality. Yes. So, yeah, how wonderful would it be to be young forever and to live forever? But as he starts to face the consequences, his wife ages and he doesn't. The people in the village start to become suspicious of them. They are shunned by the people in the village. No one buys from their farm, so they become poor. They have to move. Um, And they've lost this connection between a man and husband and wife because she knows that he's hiding something. So the tension is building up again. Thus beset, methought it was the best way to tell the truth. I revealed it as tenderly as I could, and spoke only of a very long life, not of immortality, which representation indeed coincided best with my own ideas. When I ended, I rose and said, "And now, my Bertha, will you denounce the lover of your youth? You will not, I know, but it is too hard, my poor wife, that you should suffer from my ill luck and the accursed arts of Cornelius. I will leave you. You have wealth enough, and friends will return in my absence. I will go, young as I seem and strong as I am. I can work and gain my bread among strangers, unsuspected and unknown. I loved you in youth. God is my witness that I would not desert you in age, but that your safety and happiness require it." I took my cap and moved towards the door. In a moment, Bertha's arms were round my neck, and her lips were pressed to mine. "No, my husband, my Winzy," she said, "you shall not go alone. Take me with you. We will remove from this place, and as you say, among strangers we shall be unsuspected and safe. I'm not so very old as quite to shame you, my Winzy, and I dare say the charm will soon wear off, and with the blessing of God you will become more elderly looking, as is fitting. You shall not leave me." I returned the good soul's embrace heartily. "I will not, my Bertha, but for your sake I had thought of such a thing. I will be your true, faithful husband while you are spared to me, and do my duty by you to the last." The next day we prepared secretly for our emigration. We were obliged to make great pecuniary sacrifices. It could not be helped. We realized a sum sufficient, at least, to maintain us while Bertha lived, and without saying adieu to anyone, quitted our native country to take refuge in a remote part of Western France. So he wanted to leave her, to set her free, right? His presence uh, was not being beneficial to her socially, but she doesn't want to let him go because she loves him. So they decide to go away together and they move to France. It was a cruel thing to transport poor Bertha from her native village and the friends of her youth to a new country, new language, new customs. The strange secret of my destiny rendered this removal immaterial to me, but I compassionated her deeply and was glad to perceive that she found compensation for her misfortunes in a variety of little ridiculous circumstances. Away from all telltale chroniclers, she thought to decrease the apparent disparity of our ages by 1,000 feminine arts. Rouge, youthful dress, and assumed juvenility of manner. I could not be angry. Did I not myself wear a mask? This is a very powerful question, right? So, um, Bertha, in a way, was trying to put on a mask to look younger, so then the age disparity between the two would be less. But how can he judge her? Is he also not wearing a mask? He is not, in fact, 20 years old anymore, although he looks like it. Why quarrel with hers because it was less successful? I grieved deeply when I remembered that this was my Bertha, whom I had loved so fondly and won with such transport, the dark-eyed, dark-haired girl with smiles of enchanting archness and a step like a fawn, this mincing, simpering, jealous old woman. I should have revered her grey locks and withered cheeks, but thus it was my work, I knew, but I did not the less deplore this type of human weakness. Her jealousy never slept. Her chief occupation was to discover that, in spite of outward appearances, I was myself growing old. I verily believe that the poor soul loved me truly in her heart, but never had woman so tormenting a mode of displaying fondness. She would discern wrinkles in my face and decrepitude in my walk while I bounded along in youthful vigor, the youngest looking of 20 youths. I never dared address another woman. On one occasion, fancying that the belle of the village regarded me with favoring eyes, she bought me a grey wig. Remember, jealousy is a powerful force, and it's making Bertha do things that are not part of who she truly is, and that really upsets Winsey. But he doesn't judge that because, given the circumstances, it's all his fault in a way. Her constant discourse among her acquaintances was that though I looked so young, there was ruin at work within my frame, and she affirmed that the worst symptom about me was my apparent health. My youth was a disease, she said, and I ought at all times to prepare, if not for a sudden and awful death, at least to awake some morning white-headed and bowed down with all the marks of advanced years. I let her talk. I often joined in her conjectures. Her warnings chimed in with my never ceasing speculations concerning my state, and I took an earnest, though painful, interest in listening to all that her quick wit and excited imagination could say on the subject. Why dwell on these minute circumstances? We lived on for many long years. Bertha became bedrid and paralytic. I nursed her as mother might a child. She grew peevish and still harped upon one string of how long I should survive her. It has ever been a source of consolation to me that I performed my duty scrupulously towards her. She had been mine in youth, she was mine in age, and at last, when I heaped the sod over her corpse, I wept to feel that I had lost all that really bound me to humanity. So they lived many years together, long years, um, but he never aged, but she did, and she became ill, bedridden, paralyzed, but he was always there. He felt it was his duty to take care of her. And when she dies, he feels like the last um, bound he had with humanity is lost. So he feels himself no longer human. All the people he knew, all the people he cared about, especially Bertha, have now passed away, but he still goes on as though he were still 20 years old. So he begins to see youth, beauty, and immortality as a curse. Sylvia says, besides Dorian Gray, the narrative also reminds me of James Barrie's Peter Pan when he visits Wendy again after so many years and he sees that she has aged while he is condemned to stay young. That is a very interesting association. Definitely, definitely. So the dream of being forever young is also present in Peter Pan, right? The to never lose the child within you, but if that literally happens, what are the consequences, right? So he felt no longer human. He had no connection with others. Since then, how many have been my cares and woes? How few and empty my enjoyments? I pause here in my history so that we see how the narrator is always present and he makes his presence clear, that he is telling his own story. I pause here in my history. I will pursue it no further. A sailor without rudder or compass, tossed on a stormy sea. A traveler lost on a widespread heath, without landmark or star to him. Such have I been, more lost, more hopeless than either. A nearing ship, a gleam from some far cot, may save them, but I have no beacon except the hope of death. So we're back in his present time, 1833, also the reader's present time. And now he is thinking about, he has told his story and he's thinking about um, what happens to him now and that there is no hope for him except death. Vandita says fear, insecurity, death versus courage, security, Life, some themes of contrast here. Trapped forever in immortal youth versus dying peacefully in a mortal world, aging gracefully. Yes, these are very important themes indeed. Um, Death versus courage, security, life versus death, fear. Yes, remaining forever young versus as in a cage trapped versus aging gracefully and peacefully in the mortal world and being part of the mortal human community, right? And then he starts thinking about death. Death, mysterious, ill visaged friend of weak humanity. Why alone of all mortals have you cast me from your sheltering fold? Oh, for the peace of the grave, the deep silence of the iron bound tomb. That thought would cease to work in my brain, and my heart beat no more with emotions varied only by new forms of sadness. Am I immortal? I return to my first question. In the first place, is it not more probable that the beverage of the alchemist was fraught rather with longevity than eternal life? Such is my hope. And then be it remembered that I only drank half of the potion prepared by him. Was not the whole necessary to complete the charm? To have drained half the elixir of immortality is but to be half immortal. My forever is thus truncated and null. But again, who shall number the years of the half of eternity? What does it mean? What is the half of eternity, right? And this uncertainty really drags him, exhausts him, and gives him no. He feels lost, right? A traveler lost on a widespread heath without landmark or star to him, to guide him. I often try to imagine by what rule the infinite may be divided. Sometimes I fancy age advancing upon me. One gray hair I have found. Fool, do I lament? Yes, the fear of age and death often creeps coldly into my heart, and the more I live, the more I dread death, even while I abhor life. Such an enigma is man, born to perish, when he wars as I do against the established laws of his nature. This is the paradox. Look, this is so interesting. The more he lives, the more he wants to die, but at the same time, the more he lives, the more he's afraid of death. So, how can he cope with that feeling? But for this anomaly of feeling, surely I might die. The medicine of the alchemist would not be proof against fire, sword, and the strangling waters. I have gazed upon the blue depths of many a placid lake and the tumultuous rushing of many a mighty river, and have said, peace inhabits those waters. Yet I have turned my steps away to live yet another day. I have asked myself whether suicide would be a crime in one to whom thus only the portals of the other world could be opened. I have done all except presenting myself as a soldier or a duelist, an object of destruction to my, no, not my fellow mortals, and therefore I have shrunk away. They are not my fellows. The inextinguishable power of life in my frame and their ephemeral existence places wide as the poles asunder. I could not raise a hand against the meanest or the most powerful among them. So he thinks that he is, yeah, um, perhaps not immortal, but he's also not bulletproof, right? So he would probably die with fire, sword, or strangling waters, but he does not have the courage to do it himself because he's afraid of death, although he desires it in a way. Um, and he would not put himself in the as a soldier or a duelist in opposition of another human being because he does not feel himself a human being. So he says, right, his inextinguishable existence and humans' ephemeral existence are placed wide apart as poles asunder. So that's why he cannot do it. Thus I have lived on for many a year, alone and weary of myself, desirous of death, yet never dying. A mortal, immortal. A mortal, immortal. What do you think about this title, A Mortal Immortal? Neither ambition nor avarice can enter my mind, and the ardent love that gnaws at my heart, never to be returned, never to find an equal on which to expend itself, lives there only to torment me. This very day I conceived a design by which I may end all without self slaughter, without making another man a Cain, an expedition which mortal frame can never survive, even endued with the youth and strength that inhabits mine. Thus I shall put my immortality to the test and rest forever, or return the wonder and benefactor of the human species. So he has come with a design to test his immortality without killing himself or making another man kill him. But we don't know what it is. He does not tell us, right? So there are either two things that would happen, two outcomes. Either that will indeed prove to be fatal and he will rest forever, or he will return from this test and wonder, the wonder and benefactor of the human species. So he's afraid to test his immortality. He does not want to do it in a violent way. So we don't know what his design was. Before I go, so he's still writing at the moment, right? Yeah. Before I go, a miserable vanity has caused me to pen these pages. I would not die and leave no name behind. The fear of being forgotten, right? 3 centuries have passed since I quaffed the fatal beverage. Another year shall not elapse before, encountering gigantic dangers, warring with the powers of frost in their home, beset by famine, toil, and tempest, I yield this body, too tenacious a cage for a soul which thirsts for freedom, to the destructive elements of air and water. Or, if I survive, my name shall be recorded as one of the most famous among the sons of men. And my task achieved, I shall adopt more resolute means, and by scattering and annihilating the atoms that compose my frame, set at liberty the life imprisoned within, and so cruelly prevented from soaring from this dim earth to a sphere more congenial to its immortal essence. And it ends like this, right? So it's an open-ended ending. We don't know what happens after he tested his immortality. What do you think happened to him in the end? Do you think he finally um, died and set his soul free and went to rest? Or do you think that he remains immortal and maybe wanders the earth up to our days? Um, I like open ended endings because it gives possibilities to the reader, right? I don't think we need, unless it's a different kind of book with a specific question like who killed someone, or I don't know, but generally speaking, I like when the author gives more space for the reader to interpret the text, right? So there are many possibilities here. What do you think about the title, The Mortal Immortal? I always say, I confuse it sometimes, Immortal Mortal or The Mortal Immortal. So the way it is written, The Mortal Immortal, mortal becomes an adjective and immortal a noun. So the immortal man is him, Wincy, but he's a mortal immortal. And why is that? Curious to know your thoughts. We'll return to that. And in the meantime, I would like to just mention some themes of this text. Siva says, an immortal being with mortal concerns. Yes, I would say the same. So he has a mortal, not a mortal soul. How can we explain that? Yeah, mortal concerns, as you put it, yes, but in an immortal frame, right? So that is a paradox. That is something that he has to figure out. Jenny says, I think he lived on wandering the earth alone. That could very well be. Maybe he's still out there. um, he could have studied the science himself and come up with a cure, right? But he was also afraid of dying. So um, it was this contrast, these two forces within him, to die, to live, to die, to live. And he didn't want to be the one who had to decide it for himself. So that's why he never wanted to kill himself or to let someone kill himself. He just wanted it to happen naturally, right? So Vandita already mentioned some themes before, right? So an important theme here um, is loneliness, right? So losing everything and everyone that's meaningful to you. And that makes immortality a curse rather than a blessing. You see everyone you care about die as you linger on. Vandita says, mortal who unintentionally became an immortal. Yes, that's also a possibility of interpretation. He definitely did not seek immortality, and maybe that's why he got it. I just thought of it now when I said this out loud. You know, many stories comes to my mind, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. So you could only access the stone, you could only get it if you did not mean to use it, you know. Perhaps that's why the potion was successful with him, because he didn't want to achieve immortality like Agrippa or others before him that died unsuccessful. But he unintentionally becomes immortal. Another theme is the crossing of boundaries of humanity, right? Is Winzy still human when he becomes immortal? Or does he live a sort of post human existence? And when does that happen, right? When does that shift? When does he cross the boundaries between humanity and non humanity or post humanity? And what are the consequences of this crossing of boundaries? Remember that Gothic literature is all about crossing boundaries, right? Reality and the supernatural, also boundaries crossed in this story, death and life. Sylvia says, I also thought about Harry Potter. Yes, um, there is a connection, especially with the first book, right? The Philosopher's Stone, because um, it is someone who's Nicholas Flamel, also a real philosopher. So J.K. Rowling does the same thing that Mary Shelley did here. So she gets a historical figure and makes them a character in the story, someone who's looking for the Philosopher's Stone, and in the case of Harry Potter, different from reality. Nicholas Flamel managed to find it and to live very long until he decides to die. So that's different, right? He also becomes weary of immortality and he decides to die. So, if I'm not mistaken, in Harry Potter, you have to keep drinking the elixir to carry on with immortality. Um, when it says, yes, elixir of immortality and philosopher's stone brings Harry Potter to mind, yes, but you would have to keep drinking it, right? So you eventually could stop and just wait for natural death. But that's not the case with the mortal immortal, because he has no choice. He drank it, and now he has no clue if he is to have a very long life or if he is indeed immortal. And the idea of immortality, is it a blessing or a curse? Most people would perhaps, as a first thought, instinctively think of it as a blessing. But when we really think about it, is it? It has become a curse for um, Wincy. And the very interesting paradox in this story, his immortality also increases his fear and simultaneous desire for death. He wants death as much as he's afraid of death. And I think that's a very interesting conundrum. And before I finish this session, I would like to draw some associations between the Mortal Immortal and Mary Shelley's masterpiece, Frankenstein. So, which themes overlap in this story, overlap with Frankenstein? Let me know. Well, the first one, perhaps more obvious, most obvious one, is the challenging of the laws of nature. So, Cornelius Agrippa challenges nature by creating an elixir of life that gives immortality, which is unnatural for a human being. And in Frankenstein, Victor creates this creature and brings it back to life. So that is also a way of crossing the boundaries of death and life, and natural and unnatural or supernatural. And what are the consequences of using science to cross these boundaries, right? Not good in either of the stories. There's solitude, there's loss. So, solitude in Victor, Victor becomes isolated from his friends, his family. He sees many of them dying in a similar manner as Wincy because of his crossing the boundaries, um, and loss. So the creature loses his master, feels abandoned, and Wincy loses his love. There's a question here in the chat if there will be a record of this session. Yes, so this session is being recorded. So if you could not follow it from the beginning, you can go back anytime. And it will be available here on YouTube. Another overlapping is that Wincy and the creature are doomed to live a life without affection or connections with other human beings. And also Victor Frankenstein as well. So Victor goes after the creature all the way to the Arctic, to the frozen Arctic, where he meets Robert Walton. And he shuns the presence of other human beings because he has only this object in mind, which is to get rid of his creature. And Wincy has no compass. He's just a lost man with no human attachments. And that is very, very lonely. We can only imagine. There are, of course, other parallels you can make between Wincy and Victor Frankenstein, and between the story The Mortal Immortal and Victor and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So, if you would like to know more about this masterpiece of English literature, the novel Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, there is a course, an online course at Books and Culture, that came up as a follow-up to the workshop. So we had 2 sessions of literary workshops in April to read and discuss Frankenstein, which was great. We talked about Frankenstein and the Gothic. And then there was so much more to explore in Frankenstein that I decided to create a course with 7 lessons. So you can access it at any time. And it is called Understanding Frankenstein. And this is what you will learn if you decide to join the course. So, first lesson is an introductory lesson. Who was Mary Shelley? So I give you an overview of Mary Shelley's life and writing career. Lesson 1 then is called Its Creation Story. So the writing of Frankenstein has a very interesting story in itself. It's a novel in itself. So you will learn in this lesson, you will learn about the context of creation and publication of Frankenstein, the authorship question, the different editions and read extracts from Percy Shelley's preface and Mary's introduction. Very interesting to put the novel into context. Lesson 2 is about putting the novel into its aesthetic context, so the context of Romanticism. So we explore how Frankenstein engages with the Romantic tradition in literary history, and how the novel goes beyond Romanticism and beyond Gothic, already anticipating aesthetic and content concerns that would be explored by authors in later periods. Lesson 3 is about the narrative style. Frankenstein has a very complex narrative structure. So that's what we study in this lesson, as well as the allusions and references in the novel to the myth of Prometheus, to John Milton's Paradise Lost, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So Mary Shelley creates this textual references, textual conversations that are very interesting to dig deeper and understand the novel in a more meaningful way. Lesson 4 is about the blurring lines between the monstrous and the human, and between the human and the non-human, or perhaps the human and the post-human in Frankenstein, something we touched upon briefly in this session today. Lesson 5 is called The Female Gothic. So we talk about the Gothic in English literary history, its characteristics, and how Frankenstein engages with and simultaneously challenges some of the Gothic tropes, offering new offering something new to her readership. And we also talk about the term female Gothic and how Mary Shelley positions herself as part of this female literary history with her introduction to the 1831 edition of the novel, which had her name on it. And finally, the last lesson is called The Mad Scientist, ? So we study the relationships between Shelley's novel and science, and how it anticipates the genre of science fiction. And in this lesson, we also talk about Cornelius Agrippa. So there is some historical background that will be interesting if you've read The Mortal Immortal as well. So Jenny says, such an intriguing story. I love learning about the context of the story, makes it more meaningful. Yes, it makes the reading experience so much different, so much more meaningful, so much more interesting, right? Siva says, it was a lovely, informative workshop. Thank you so much. You're welcome. It's great to have you here. Jenny says, really enjoyed today's session. Thank you. Awesome. I hope you enjoyed knowing more about this other side of Mary Shelley's writing career. So the writing of short stories, the publication of literary annuals, the keepsake, and the connections between this story and Frankenstein. So if you want to sign up for the online course, Understanding Frankenstein, you can do so via the website booksandculture.club, or if you want to access it more directly, booksandculture.club/join-understanding-Frankenstein, and dig deep into one of these classics of literature. Vandita says, thank you, Fernanda. This was an interesting Gothic short story. Lovely session. Thank you so much. It was great having you here, and we'll see each other again. It was great being live again to talk to you. I wouldn't say face to face, but in real time. And we'll see each other in another literary event at Books and Culture. Bye.